Hey everybody. This is chapter 1 of part 4 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, part 1, the dominated Class Struggles in the USSR third period, 1930 to 1941, part 1, the dominated. Excuse me. And part 4 is titled Capital and Its Crises. And the first chapter of part 4 is titled Accumulation in 1928 to 1940. So, here we go. And there's a little introduction of part 4 as a whole, and I'm going to read that too. One second. It's funny, there's footnotes to this. There's endnotes to this one-page section. Anyway, here we go. Capital and Its Crisis, Part 4 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR. The third period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, the dominated. The dominant aspect of the development process of production forces during the 1930s in the Soviet Union was industrialization. Industrialization benefited from maximum investment. The working class grew at an exceptional speed. Soviet industry experienced a particularly fast expansion. Although there is no doubt that official statistics relating to global industrial production have a tendency to, quote, inflate, end quote, the size of the results obtained, and although this, quote, inflation, end quote, is due simultaneously to the way in which the statistics were calculated and to the way in which the basic data were collected, it is nevertheless true that in the 1930s there was a real, quote, industrial revolution, end quote, on a scale without historical precedent, but which has since had equivalents, particularly in Japan. Footnote. This problem has been studied by many writers. These include especially D. Hodgman, Soviet Industrial Production 1928 to 1951, A. Bergson, Soviet Economic Growth 1953, and the part devoted to the USSR in Capital Formation and Economic Growth, published in 1955. End footnote. The Index of Industrial Production revised by Hodgman, which seems especially typical, moves from a base of 100 in 1928 to 1930. It moves from a base in 1928. Jesus Christ. I fucking blew this up. Oh, there's another footnote that I missed. Man, this is a terrible video. In fact, if one takes into account technical progress and product quality in Japan, the latter's industry has performed considerably better than Soviet industry did. End footnote. The Index of Industrial Production revised by Hodgman, which seems especially typical, moves from a base of 100 in 1928 to 371 in 1937 and 430 in 1940. Other calculations present a picture of an industrial growth a little less rapid, but which nevertheless was remarkable. Footnote. The diversity of recent estimations of Soviet industrial production growth with copious references can be seen in Slavic Review, December 1980, with its articles by S. Rosefield, H. Hunter, R. W. Davies, and S. G. Wheatcroft. End footnote. The exceptional performances, however, should not put into oblivion the social conditions in which they were achieved, nor must they hide the fact that According to the official statistics themselves, the rate of development of industrial production fell from one 5-year plan to the next. End footnote. Footnote. On this point, see Moshe Lewin, its article, The Disappearance of Planning in the Plan, published in Slavic Review, June 1973. According to official statistics, the annual industrial growth rates for each of the 3 first plans were respectively 19.2, 17.1, and 13.2%, the latter covering the first 3.5 years of the plan. Of course, if the elements of overestimation included in the official figures are removed, the growth rates appear weaker. Thus, N. Kaplan has calculated that for 1933 to 40, the average annual rate of industrial production growth was 8.8%. See N. Kaplan's article, Retardation in Soviet Growth, published in the Review of Economics and Statistics, August 1968. End footnote. The fall of the industrial production growth rate cannot be separated from another very significant fact: the weak growth rate of industrial labor productivity, which contrasts with the scale of technical change that was accomplished. Footnote, thus taking 1928 as 100, the index of daily productivity per head employed in main industry was 167 in 1940. Parenthesis, that is the same as in 1937, in parenthesis. This index calculated by Hodgman in Soviet Industrial Production, page 117, end footnote. The slow growth of labor productivity, the progressive fall of growth rates for industrial production, and above all the crises that the Soviet economy experienced are manifestations of the limits of the success brought by the industrialization of the USSR. And this is not the only thing, for the beginnings of this industrialization were accompanied, as has been shown in this volume, by a serious decline in the living standards of the masses and by recourse on a large scale to penal labor. Okay, so here we are. Now we get to Chapter 1. Accumulation in 1928 to 1940. Between 1928 and 1940, the Soviet Union experienced a gigantic accumulation of material resources devoted to industry and especially to heavy industry. One statistical index reflects the, quote, official accounting, end quote, for the material resource accumulation of the Soviet Union. This was the index expressing the volume growth of, quote, basic capital, end quote, parenthesis, fixed capital, end parenthesis, at the disposition of the productive and non-productive sectors. According to official statistics, the, quote, value, end quote, parenthesis, in, quote, constant prices, end quote, end parenthesis, of the, quote, basic capital, end quote, grew from an index of 100 in 1928 to 312 in 1940. One second. Okay. However, these figures have only a very limited significance. In fact, when one compares them with other Soviet statistics, it is clear they overestimate very much the growth of material resources accumulated during these years. This overestimation to a large extent resulted from the method used for the construction of this index because, 1. The index does not take into account the greater part of the destruction of material resources suffered by the Soviet economy during the 1930s, especially the destruction that struck agriculture following forced, quote, collectivization, end quote. Footnote, for an estimate of the destruction of means of production in agriculture, see N. Jasny and Soviet Industrialization, published in 1961. End footnote. To this destruction should be added that connected with the abandonment of most equipment used by private industry and by artisans. In fact, from 1930, almost all this equipment was stopped because it was usually of no use to the state's large-scale industry. 2. The official index was calculated in, quote, comparable prices, end quote, which means that the investments towards the end of the period had to be, quote, deflated, end quote, in order to eliminate the influence of the price rise between 1928 and 1940. However, it would clearly seem that the size of this rise of prices was underestimated, and therefore the coefficients of deflation that were adopted were too small. 3. The capital invested continued to be valued at its original cost, and therefore its value at the end of the period was not reduced to take into account the wear and tear of equipment. Although the index, which claimed thus to, quote, measure, unquote, the accumulation of material resources in the period 1928 to 40, overestimates the net result. It all the same has the merit of giving an idea of the size of investment carried out during the first 3 5-year periods. New section, Investments made 1928 to 1940. As for the years 1928 to 1937, an estimate of the value of investments is as follows. Between 1928 and 1932, 67.2 billion rubles in constant prices, and from 1933 to 1937, 151.7 billion rubles in constant prices. Although between 1937 and 1940 the growth of gross investments slackened, gross investments value, parenthesis, quote, in constant prices, end quote, in parentheses, still grew, in total by 30% according to official statistics. Between 1928 and 1940, the growth of gross investment was exceptionally high, on the order of 14% annually. Footnote, the figures for gross investment evidently do not take into account, quote, disinvestment, end quote, accompanying the process of primitive accumulation, nor do they show fluctuations and regressions of investment which occurred during the crises, as will be seen. End footnote. According to the official statistics, the investments made during the two first 5-year plans and the 3 1/2 years of the third 5-year plan were divided as follows. And there's a chart that says distribution of gross investment, coal causes excluded during the first 3 5-year plans. And these are percentages. Industry, 41.5% of total gross investment. Agriculture, 8% of total gross investment. Transport, 20.5% of total gross investment. Housing, parenthesis, excluding individual construction, in parenthesis, 11.5% of total gross investment. Trade, communal enterprises, and scientific, cultural, educational, and health institutions, 18.5% of total gross investment. And obviously the total is 100% gross investment for all of them. It can be seen that industry received more than 2/5 of state investment, while agriculture was reduced to a beggar's portion. Parenthesis, taking into account coal cause investments would not change this picture substantially. End parenthesis. Housing construction was equally neglected. Footnote, the figures for gross investment. Sorry, I think I already said that footnote. Sorry. I thought I missed it. Footnote, from 1929 to the war, there were built around about 140 million square meters of housing financed by the state or cooperative organizations. During the same period, the urban population grew by nearly 30 million, while part of the housing stock deteriorated. Hence, there was a serious decline in housing conditions that became catastrophic. End footnote. A very large proportion of investment went to heavy industry, parenthesis, Group A, end parenthesis, and to transport and communication within industry. Less than 1/6 of investment was devoted to increasing the production potential of consumer goods, or Group B. In general, the enormous investment effort of these years, which was a heavy burden on the real income of the population, therefore did very little to improve living conditions. The principal exception was the investment made for education and health. However, these investments above all benefited the urban population. Moreover, access to better hospital services was reserved to those who were part of the managing apparatus and their families. New section, section 2. The economic weight of investment. For most of the 1930s, the rapid increase of investment did not bring the expected growth of total income and of production. In fact, the brutal and in practice chaotic increase of gross accumulation resulted in a veritable dislocation of production, especially in agriculture. I'm going to repeat that sentence because there's italics in it. For most of the 1930s, the rapid increase of investment did not bring the expected growth of total income and of production. In fact, the brutal and in practice chaotic increase of gross accumulation resulted in a veritable dislocation of production, especially in agriculture. This, for several years, entailed a decrease in the availability of consumer goods. The, quote, economic weight, end quote, of the rapid increase of accumulation is difficult to, quote, measure. However, an idea can be gained by comparing the rate of investment recorded in 1928 with that recorded in 1937. Between these 2 years, this rate passed from 7% to 21% of the national product, almost in 9 years, which was an upheaval on an exceptional scale, and it is understandable that it seriously disturbed the reproduction of the material and social conditions of production. The growth recorded for the rate of accumulation is in correlation with the putting into force of the first 5-year plans. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.